Hello, Tanner, Ashton, and Lily. I'm Joe. Nice to meet you. Um, I actually thought this would be an easier form of communication than writing a response to your 12 questions, so I'm just going to answer them, just as though you were interviewing me. So hopefully you can hear okay. I'm sitting outside because it's so nice. What is the most compelling story of sex trafficking that I've heard? Um, this is probably the story that got me started with being inspired to be involved at all. We were having a small group from our church get together at our home, and we'd invited a young lady to come and speak to us about what human trafficking was. And up till that point, I never really even knew what it was about. And she started to unpack sort of the whole methodology, mainly around sex trafficking. They weren't really talking about labor at that time, and began telling us a story about two sisters, ages 6 and 8, that were being trafficked by their mother for drugs, for methamphetamine. She was addicted to meth, and she was trading her children to her drug dealer in order to get drugs for sex. And I was so blown away by that, just that concept. And, at that time, our girls were right around that age, and they were upstairs asleep in their pink, purple, and baby blue bedrooms, comfy and cozy in their sweet little beds. And, being a Christian based on my faith, I believe that everyone is created equal. There's no difference between those little girls and my girls who were asleep upstairs. And so it sure seemed like people should be fighting for them. And so we decided at that time to get involved and to actually just start donating a little bit of money at that time. And that then snowballed into the job that I now hold as CEO of Freedom United. As far as child labor goes, which was your second question, that would probably also be a local story. I had read some quotes from some kids. They were, I think, also siblings, 12 and 16 years old, and the quotes were just talking about how hard the labor was that they were being forced to do. And it was strange because I didn't know the whole story at first, but they kept talking about being ill and being sick, and the work making them sick to their stomachs, but they'd have to get up the next day and do it again and again. And it wasn't until later that I found out that the reason why they were ill was that they were actually being forced to pick tobacco. And sometimes when you use your hands to harvest tobacco, the tobacco itself actually makes you ill. And so these kids would be vomiting and not be able to eat, and then they'd just be forced to work again and again. So that was one of the early stories that I heard. I'd throw in a second one just because it was a firsthand experience, and it took a second for me to even realize that it was forced labor. We were on a missions trip in Guatemala last summer, and there was we were at dinner in a marketplace, and a young lady was coming around, and she was selling toys and trinkets and things. And one of the folks in our group bought this little floating bird from her. And as I sat there looking at her, I started to realize, wait a minute, what is this kid doing? Where is she from? Who's in charge of her? She didn't speak English, but I was inspired to get up and leave and follow her. And so I followed the little girl through the market and watched her selling her wares, and then she went into a couple of stores and did some trading in a few stores for some items, and then went to an old woman and handed her her money to an older lady, and then went back out to sell some more. And I stopped her, and I said, are you what was that? I actually asked her, was that your grandmother, your abuela? And she said no. and I said, you know, why are you doing this? Why do you sell things? And she said, mi trabajo, which means my job, my work. So it was actually her job to go around and sell. And she was probably 11, 10, Olivia's age. So anyway, a couple of examples. What can people do to stop sex trafficking? I think first and foremost is for people to be informed, especially young people to be informed on how it happens, how it works. It doesn't. One of the big dilemmas in this space is that we use imagery to portray sex trafficking that's just untrue. So the imagery that we use a lot of times is more like kidnapping. So it's ropes and gagging and tape over people's mouths and things like that, as though people are taken off street corners or grabbed, which does happen, but it's not typical trafficking. Typically, trafficking here in the U.S., the majority of the time it actually happens in runaway situations, or in situations where a young person is being recruited by a peer. And so, many trafficking victims are in school. They did a study not long ago and to show that a tremendous amount of trafficking victims are still in school. And part of their job, besides being sex trafficked, is that they're also supposed to recruit. So they actually need to be recruiting at all times. So a lot of times you'll get duped into going to a party or meeting someone's older boyfriend or something like that. Most of the women who I've met that I formed relationships with and become friends with who have been trafficked, all of them got into a relationship with a man that they trusted. They thought that this person cared about them. And that can easily happen when you're young. And to be able to spot those signs and understand it and have open dialogue with your parents, and I would say that's probably the number one way to begin to eliminate sex trafficking is awareness. The other way is to eliminate demand. Demand is very difficult because there is an evil propensity of people to want to buy sex from people who are underage. And if you're under the age of 18 and you're selling your body, it's immediately deemed here in the United States as being sex trafficking. It doesn't even matter if you've agreed to it or if you think this is your job or whatever. If you're under the age of 18, then you're being trafficked. So that is an important thing. The other thing is for people to watch out for the signs of trafficking, which you can look that up online, signs of trafficking, and just be aware and speak up and watch out for each other. What impact have you made in the world of sex trafficking? Wow. I think that, Freedom United, we see hundreds of thousands of visitors to our website every month, and we know that we're constantly informing people and teaching people and training people what different forms of modern slavery are. We don't necessarily call out sex trafficking specifically and focus on it. In fact, we probably spend more time on labor than we do on sex trafficking, merely because the predominant numbers around those enslaved in the world are more on the labor side than on the sex side. So we probably spend more time on labor. But we've had a lot of really great campaigns around both labor and sex trafficking. I would actually say that one of our biggest impacts, and this isn't specifically around ending sex trafficking, but changing the dialogue around sex trafficking, because I was mentioning that we use this imagery that depicts kidnapping, and we launched a campaign about a year and a half ago called My Story, My Dignity, and it was actually inspired by survivors. So it's actually a survivor-led campaign where survivors of trafficking are actually partnered with us on this campaign, and it's demanding that that companies who are large news outlets tell survivor stories with dignity, that they ask permission to tell their stories, that often they'll allow survivors to review the story before it's published, and to allow survivors to have a say in what gets out there and how it's presented. A lot of times news publications will, they'll present the story in the most engaging way possible, and it might not be the most correct way. And so that's actually changed the dialogue in a really big way. A lot of that also revolved around the imagery that was used, that's used in the global movement to depict trafficking and modern slavery. And we've seen a definite movement in the past 2 years since starting this campaign, to where more and more organizations are standing up and saying, wait a minute, why are we using imagery like this? Why are we talking about it like this? It doesn't actually help people to understand it any better. In fact, a lot of times it just scares people away because it's so petrifying. Black and white images of, naked women in chains and, beaten, when that's not typically what trafficking looks like. It may inevitably end up with physical abuse or things like that. But how are victims tricked into sex trafficking? I gave a couple of examples there. The reality is that the majority of it is people who are actually looking to fill a void of some kind. Even on the labor side, it's to fill a void of money. So people want to work, they want to make money, and then someone comes along and exploits them in some way, shape, or form. It's the same way with love. So traffickers will use love on a regular basis, and or the falsehood of loving someone or caring about someone or taking care of them or taking care of their children, and then will eventually let them know that part of being in this relationship is that you go out and you earn money for me, and this is the way that you do it. So it's usually a slow process. It's a much slower process than most people realize. It's actually building a relationship with someone, and that's why it's so hard to get out sometimes, because you do have a long-term relationship. Sometimes people have relationships where they have children with their traffickers, and that makes it even more confusing and more difficult to recognize the fact that you're being exploited and to accept the fact that you want to get out of it. So it's a very tricky thing. What made you want to start a nonprofit to end human slavery? I think I already answered that one. I answered the trafficking part. So I quit my job a little over 5 years ago with a real call on my heart to just have a significant impact on the world. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't know that it was going to be in the field of trafficking and modern slavery. I just knew that, and again, this goes back to my faith. Freedom United isn't a faith-based nonprofit, which is actually a legal definition of the type of nonprofit that you are, but it's very much a faith-driven nonprofit in that I'm the founder and the CEO, and I'm very faith-driven. So for me, it was a matter of I was feeling a need to respond to God's overwhelming blessings on my life in an audacious way. I didn't feel like I could do something. I couldn't take a small swing to try to reply to the amazing gifts that God had bestowed on me, especially, financially. We'd sold a business, and I was able to take time off and not have income for an extended period of time, and be able to. I'm a volunteer CEO, so I don't actually get paid to do my job, and so I felt like all of that really needed the correct response, and the response, at least for me, wasn't to work on something small. I wanted to work on something big and try to have a really massive impact, because that's what I felt like God had done to my life. He hadn't done something small. He'd been really extravagant in just pouring blessing over me. After women, men, children are no longer needed for sexual activity, are they used in other areas, released or killed? That's interesting. No, the reason why sex trafficking is such a good business for bad guys is because the inventory. So if you imagine that you're a drug dealer, the inventory is drugs, right? So let's imagine it's cocaine. Well, if I sell the cocaine, then I have to get more cocaine. And so I have to have this whole supply thing. So I sell a bag of cocaine. In order for me to make any more money, I got to come up with another bag of cocaine. The beauty for bad guys in this business is that I can sell this inventory over and over and over and over again. So I don't have to go find another person. I can sell this person again. I can sell them 7 times a day. And so typically the goal is to extend a trafficked victim's usefulness as long as possible. Typically, they may be released in Southeast Asia. You know, there is a point where you kind of you may age out of being valuable. You're typically in that scenario you're just dumped. The problem is that in so many of these countries where this happens, once you've been trafficked and people know about it, you're also then shunned. And so people know that you're dirty, or they believe that you're dirty. And so it's very difficult to rebuild your life and to become a strong survivor after the situation. What's the most common age of people being trafficked? Boy, that's really all over the place. Definitely younger. You know, here in the United States, it starts as, you know, average age I think is 14 for child sex trafficking. Globally, if you look at forced marriage, for example, so we spend time on forced marriage. The difference between forced marriage and arranged marriage. Arranged marriage, you actually have the choice to either not get married or get out of the marriage. A forced marriage is you have no choice. In the forced marriage scenario, you know, there's a crazy stat, which is 1 in 9 girls under the age of 12 are forced into marriage in the world today. 1 in 9, which I believe is a CARE, care.org. It's a stat on their site that you could cite. So it's really all over the place. It just depends on what the opportunity is for whoever is exploiting the person in the scenario that they're in. How can we educate people in our society on trafficking? Social media, you know, sharing things on social media, but really talking to people. I find that, you know, social has become so noisy and loud, and it's hard to really get anyone's attention for a long period of time. But when you sit down and actually have a conversation with somebody about this, and especially with young people, with folks who are your age, for adults to be willing to talk about these things. You know, for my high schooler and her friends, they've all heard they're about done with Mr. Joe and all of his trafficking talk. But I would rather be biting off these topics than for them to be sneaking up on people. But the other thing is, you know, forget about how old you are. So you know, we've got heck, my kid, my youngest, Olivia, when she was 9, she did a lemonade stand for freedom and sold lemonade outside of Food Lion and told people what human trafficking was in her way. We've had high school students in Indiana who have visited their state legislature demanding stronger penalties for those who were victimizing people. We've had middle schoolers who have spoken at churches all over the country, teaching churches about what trafficking is. So, you know, whatever you're comfortable doing, and your parents agree to, you know, it's never too early to start to advocate for those who don't share the same freedoms than we do. I believe all people are called to do that. How many projects do you help fund in a year to end human trafficking, and how many people are saved? This is a really hard number to be able to give. It's actually a big struggle for us because a lot of funders like to know numbers. We usually launch somewhere between 6 and 12 campaigns annually where we're working with nonprofits around the world trying to help them make change happen. But to put a number on it, again, is very difficult because the majority of the projects that we work on are what we would consider systemic change. So I'll give you an example. In the country of Uzbekistan, there is a government-driven slavery in the cotton industry. So the cotton in the country of Uzbekistan is all owned by the government. And so once a year, when it's time to pick the cotton, the government goes out to the schools and the hospitals, and they get the nurses and the teachers, and they load them up on buses, and they take them out to fields, and they pick cotton for 2 weeks. And they live in shanties, in makeshift housing. And then when their cotton's all picked, they bring them back, drop them off at school, and nobody gets paid for anything, and you're just expected to do it. School shuts down. And we've been fighting this for years now, and we're on the verge of the Uzbekistani government actually changing these laws. Part of our team actually went to Uzbekistan as part of a UN coalition middle of last year, and we're actually starting to see a shift where I think in the next couple of years we will eliminate this form of slavery in Uzbekistan. Now, that might affect 200,000 to 300,000 people in the country of Uzbekistan annually. So for us to say that had an effect on 200,000 or 300,000 people might be true. However, I would actually start to argue that because it's a systemic change, you have to look at those 200,000 to 300,000 people over history. So it might be 200,000 to 300,000 people today, but if nobody would do anything about it, it would be 200,000 to 300,000 people next year, and 200,000 or 300,000 people the year after that, and we've seen slavery go on for generation to generation to generation, and that's been happening for all of time. So it's really difficult to put numbers on it. And for me and the work that we do, for our donors, not so much, because they like to see absolute numbers. For me and the work that we do, I'm okay no matter what the number is, as long as we're heading towards saving one person from being trapped in modern slavery, then it's something worth working on. But the majority of the stuff that we're working on is pretty significant numbers. What do you think the worst aspect of child labor is? Worst aspect of child labor. I'd probably go with what Olivia's thoughts are on it. My youngest, she did a video and said that she thinks it's just not cool that a kid isn't able to have a childhood, that they're forced to work instead of be able to be a kid. No matter what that means, no matter where you are, no matter what a kid means in your culture, the fact that instead you're forced to labor and be exploited by an adult who is treating you as less of a human being than themselves. That's pretty unacceptable. I will add, though, because I appreciate that that's asking about children. Children actually are, though I feel horrible for kids stuck in child labor, the one that really gets me is adults who are forced into labor, and the reason why that one bothers me so much is that the majority of forced labor that exists in the world today are people who are trying to get a job and work to support and take care of those whom they love. Even with sex trafficking, a lot of times. These are people who are trying to work. They want to work. They want to put their hands in soil and work to make money to support their families. And that desire to do the right thing, in my opinion, to do the right thing and care for those that you love, is exploited by evil. And that, to me, is just that's just horrific, um, especially systematically, that it systematically happens to tens of millions of people. Of course, child sex trafficking and all of that is just, physically repulsive, but just the concept of tens of millions of grown people who are trying to care for their families being exploited on a regular basis and being trafficked and put into modern slavery just because they're trying to take care of their families. It's just unacceptable. Do you think trafficking will ever be eliminated? No, I don't. I don't think. I think that there is an innate battle between, good and evil in the world. Without getting off on a way crazy religious tangent, um, I think that we can reduce trafficking and modern slavery significantly. Significantly. Tens of millions of people can be saved from this horrific crime. But the fact is that this is a crime that makes money for bad people. And if you can make money at it and there's a demand for it, then people will do it. We've seen that in all of time, all of history. That has proven itself. So, though I would love to say that we'll end it all, it's a big truck. I'm too much of a too pragmatic to believe that that it will just be eliminated. But just because it won't be eliminated, that means nothing to me. It doesn't matter. It's a matter of eliminating it for one person at a time, and just trying to end it for as many people as we possibly can while we're here. Hey, thanks for these questions. If some of this didn't come through or it didn't make sense, you guys want to follow up with anything, any other questions, just shoot them to me. Thanks again for picking this topic, and I hope that this inspires y'all to become lifelong abolitionists and just start asking questions about things. Why do people do what they do? Why are people making the choices that they do? Why do people look scared when they shouldn't be? Where do my clothes come from? What are we buying? What are we eating? What do supply chains look like? All those things. Those are questions that we as kids, we never even thought to ask those questions. But you're a generation that can, and you're a generation that can save tens of millions of people from what I believe is the most profound evil to potentially ever exist. See ya.